Okay, hello, welcome back everyone. Happy Wednesday. And let's get on with the rest of the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so where did we leave off? We left off with general and special senses. So to recap, there are a bunch of general senses, and again, so what's the difference again? Well, remember that special senses, they're special not because they're more important, but because they're localized to certain organs in the body. So again, general senses are things you can feel on multiple parts of your body or perceive in multiple parts of your body. And things like proprioception, all of these right here. Special senses, including the 4 of the 5 you learned in elementary school, these are special senses, but equilibrium is that one that's located also in the inner ear. So again, touch is, even though you learned that as the fifth sense, it's more of a general sense because again, you can feel things touching you on multiple parts of the body, but things that the fifth special sense is equilibrium. But we get to that at the end of the semester. Again, remember that different senses require detect different signals. That's why we have different neurons that are specialized to detect these different types of signals. So with all sorts of signals, you need something happening to some neuron that carries that tells the rest of your nervous system, hey, we have the signal, we have this change in our environment. So again, this is why you have all these receptors, and again, this isn't all the receptors you have in your body. And even more so, again, don't get confused with receptor proteins and receptor cells. So again, most of the time, at least in this chapter, when I use the word receptor, I'm talking about some sort of cell or neuron that detects a stimulus. Okay, so here we have, okay, so here's general sense receptors, and furthermore, these these sensory receptors can be broken down and or classified, I should say, into different types of receptors. So you have exteroreceptors, which detect external stimuli. So again, you're always perceiving things from your environment, right? Like how hot or cold it is, or how much light. And you're actually perceiving light right now if you're watching it, that's right, because you're seeing the letters on the screen. Those are different wavelengths of light hitting your retina, and your brain is interpreting it. It's all signals from their environment. Or even things like you might not be aware of, like how the pressure or of the chair you're sitting in, or with the ground you're standing on right now while watching this lecture. And then you also have interoreceptors. So instead of detecting stimuli and changes in your external environment, now your body is detecting its own internal environment. And the cool thing about your body is it's able to detect things like pH, oxygen, carbon dioxide, stretch of tissues. So you have all these or how like swollen and distended certain organs are, like your bladder or your intestines. So you also have all these interoreceptors that help to not only engage the outside of your body, but also its internal environment as well. And one thing we didn't get to cover at the last lecture are proprioceptors. And these are fascinating. And again, that sense of proprioception is something that we're always using, but we kind of take for granted because it's just something that's so natural to us. So proprioceptors, can't English today, they detect body position. So basically, like pretend like you can do this at home with if you have a friend or a partner or someone else you can do this with. But say pretend you're at home and you close your eyes and you have your friend like move your arm and then move it to the side or toward your back or toward your front. Now, you know that they're moving it toward your back. You know they're moving your arm around and you know generally where your arm is in position, but how do you know if your eyes are closed? Well, you can kind of feel it somehow. And what is that feeling of where your body is? That proprioception is part of that feeling of knowing where your body parts are. Or say like, have you ever been in or like especially if you've been in a plane and someone has a backpack on and they hit you with the backpack, and the thing is that they connected with your body, but why didn't they really have a good sense of knowing where you were and where their backpack was? Well, they only have sensory receptors in their backpack that tell them where their backpack is. They know where their body is, or let's rewind that. So, like, have you ever like passed by someone and you just kind of know, like, you pass by really close, but you know how far you are from them so that you don't actually clip shoulders or bump into them, Or if you're trying to hug a corner, you know that, okay, I'm not going to whack myself and whack my arm or shoulder as I'm trying to round the corner. So you always have some sort of sense where your body is, but it's just something we kind of take for granted. And also balance as well. So body position and balance are also involved in proprioception. So it's about knowing where your body is in space. And or another thing, like say for example, if you play sports, like if you're an amateur like me, like if you're trying to catch a ball, like see, make a ball here. Like do you, when you see baseball players catch a ball, are they always looking at their hand and arms and what or are they looking at the ball? How do they know where to position their hands so that they can catch the ball? So the thing is that they have some sort of proprioception. They know where their arms and hands are in space, and they also know how to position it without having to look constantly between the ball they're trying to catch and their hands. Or if you're trying to type right now, I mean, some people they still look at their fingers when they type, but if you're like me and you know how to touch type, or if you know how to play piano, do pianists always do they look at the sheet music, or it's assuming they use the sheet music? Do they need to always look at their fingers and go between the sheet music and their fingers? No, the more they practice it, the more they know that where their fingers are positioned and how much more they need to stretch their fingers to reach the appropriate keys. So proprioception occurs on the big scale and the small scale. It's about knowing where your body is and without really so it's kind of like knowing where your body is but without really consciously thinking about it. Now, they also involve in movement as well. So this is one way you can test proprioception. So this is what we call the Romberg's test. And no, she's not pretending she's trying to be a zombie. What she's doing is that they're trying to, first you have them stand and you look at the patient. And there's variations of this, but one thing is, um, oh yeah, wait, is this different from the thing in your equilibrium? Yeah. So yeah, it's easy. I gotta admit, even for me, defining the difference between proprioception and equilibrioception in the ear, I think the best and maybe like some people are more like or like I think the my favorite ways to describe is like equilibrioception in your inner ear is like head position and proprioception is like body position. But I know it's kind of inexact, but they both kind of help with your overall sense of balance. Yeah, so Romberg's test tests proprioception, and there's variations of this, but in general, what they do is have someone stand and you observe the patient, and then there's like the exact times you have them like do the different phases. It depends on like it varies depends on the clinic or person doing the evaluation. But you see whether they start to sway or waver or they're kind of off balance. And yeah, if their eyes are open and their hands are on the side and they're just standing up, they're kind of shaking, that's already kind of a sign that they may have a problem with their balance and proprioception. But we have to have, okay, I guess there used to be more of an animation. But one thing is that your sense of body position is also not only in terms of proprioception and your inner ear, but you also have visual impact as well. Like I think I remember if you ever been in some of those like there used to be a what's it called? Was it Exploratorium in San Francisco where there was like there's this cool room or this cool experiment where you try to stand on one leg and then they basically do this thing where there's this pattern and then you have someone else move the pattern in front of your eyes and you just can't keep still and keep balance because for some reason the visual feedback throws you off and you just lose your balance. Well, thing is that visual input is a big part of our balance as well. So what she's doing is closing her eyes. So you're no longer getting that kind of input like where you are and that you're not moving because if your visual field and what you're seeing right now is static, that means you're not moving. But with these people who have impaired proprioception, what happens when you take that away from the equation? Well, now they just have to kind of feel where their body is in space. So if they have something that altered their proprioception and balance, what happens is that they'll close their eyes. The ground's not moving, but then they'll start moving and then they'll start doing that. And also moving their hands forward or lifting their arms. Sometimes that exaggerates that swaying and movement. So notice that he has his hand toward, or his left arm toward her back. So just in case she starts swaying, you want to kind of have people to spot to make sure this person doesn't actually fall over during this test. So this is a cool thing. Like, your balance is more than just proprioception and equilibrioception in your inner ear. It also involves visual feedback. So this Romberg test takes away that visual feedback to test your other two senses and how they contribute to your balance. And proprioception, so again, it's a general sense and uses these proprioceptor and sensory neurons. So this is just talking about these sensory neurons that help give your sense of balance. So, or proprioception, I should say. So these muscle spindles, these are receptors that are located and intertwined within the tissues of your muscle fibers. They also help to determine the amount of stretch of your muscles, so whether your muscles are fully contracted or relaxed. And then you also have these Golgi tendon organs that detect the amount of stretch in these Golgi tendons as well. So it's within the muscles themselves, but also in the tendons that attach these muscles to bones. And you also have mechanoreceptor neurons within the joint capsule itself. So there are multiple types of sensory neurons in the muscle, within the connective tissue, and within the joint itself that help to tell you, okay, is my joint fully flexed? Is it fully or extended? What's the degree of extension? What's the degree of... So again, when we do this, like if you're typing right now and can touch type, you don't really think about the amount of stretch in your fingers when you're typing. It's just something that your body kind of knows through this proprioception, where the position of your fingers are, and also like how much you need to move these fingers to get to your fingers to the right key to type whatever you want to do without actually looking at it. So here's a muscle spindle, and notice that this receptors right here is carrying these afferent signals toward the central nervous system. And you also have this is a spindle within the organ, so what's showing is kind of pulling apart this muscle spindle fiber, or pulling apart the fibers of this muscle. And yeah, so all of these are going to sense the amount of stretch in this muscle over here. And actually, in relatively recent events, remember that whole thing with like, well, this is why she had the gold on the uniform. Like, how many gold medals did she have before, and how many championships, and how she was undefeated before that? Well, that was big news when Simone Biles, the greatest gymnast of all time, female gymnast of all time, withdrew from those events suddenly in the Olympics. And then she did mention mental health, but people were starting to have rumors and all the speculation. And she then brought up something called the twisties. And I was like, well, what are the twisties? And then the more I read about it, it sounds like the complex spirit system in the brain that keeps gymnasts balanced that gets out of whack. I'm like, oh, it's the proprioception. And this is an interesting thing too, is like the twisties and it seems like all the gym people on Twitter who were gymnasts are like, oh yeah, we know what that is. So what happens is that she was doing that, I think when you saw that last kind of flip she did, I mean it was kind of scary. It did look like uncharacteristic. She was really stumbling and it sounds like she lost sense of where she is in the air. And these gymnasts, they do all this stuff, they spin and flip at the same time and they somehow land on their feet. So it's very important for them to know like where they are, where their body parts are, so they're able to land correctly. At least that's my layman's explanation. So she said she had no idea where she was in the air. She could have hurt herself, and yeah, I mean you don't want to land on your neck rather than landing on your feet. So what happens here is that yeah, there's visual cues, but at the same time when you're doing that kind of activity, I mean, I'm pretty sure like she's used to it, and like athletes at that level, they're used to like. I mean, if you flipped me around and spun me around like how she does during a jump, I would be disoriented. But if you have like a lack, but at the same time, like how fast can our eyes really keep up with like a room that's spinning around us and lights that are moving around us at all times? You also have to kind of know when to kind of for this part, or just like when you're trying to like jump from somewhere and land somewhere, you kind of just have to kind of know how to put your body so that you're able to land feet first and not like fall when you land, right? So apparently these like gymnasts at her level, they just kind of have this proprioception and this ability to just know where to position all their body parts so that they can execute all these tricks, but also when to pull out of these and end up in some sort of landing position so they can like stick the landing and not stumble around like we saw just before she withdrew. So sense of where her body is, that seems like for some reason she just lost that ability during I know it's like during the biggest stages. I have heard other things too, like other sports called the yips as well. So it sounds something similar, like some sort of mental block where you have these people who rehearse this repetitive motion all the time and they're practiced over and over again, and for some reason they just suddenly lose ability for whatever reason. Interesting. I'm no sort sports psychologist, but again, this is an point here is saying like, yeah, proprioception is something we take for granted, but if you kind of lose it, then that really affects your life. Okay, so let's boot up Top Hat. I know it's been a while, so let's do some little quick questions. Browser. So a little review for everybody. And this is a sorting question. Can you put these regions with the top one at the, or the most superior at the top, and the most inferior at the bottom? And yes, this is review. Okay, let's see the answer. So this is the most popular order, and the most popular order is correct. So again, it's good to know these regions. If you didn't get this on the when we talked about the skeletal system, this is your chance to know this now. Next question. Fill in the blank. And I'm serious. It's not a trick question, but there's a reason why I'm asking this. How many months are in a year? Don't overthink this. This isn't one of those riddles like, how many months of the year have 28 days? It's not one of those questions. Okay, hopefully everyone got this correct. Yay, everyone got it correct. Thank goodness. I'd be kind of worried. Or if you did get it wrong, I'd say you're overthinking things. Alright, so what is the maximum number of days in any given month? Like, of all the months, what is the maximum? So what is the maximum possible number of days you can have in a month? Okay, let's see the answers. Ooh, so close. So yeah, January, spooky month. December, what is the last day of all those months? Yeah, so maximum number that can happen in any given month. So the maximum possible days is 31. Yeah, there are months that have different ones, but why am I making a big deal about 12 and 31? Well, let's go back to our lecture and I'll explain why we went with this little calendar thing. So this is one way I know. So how are cranial and spinal nerves like a calendar? And this is where I'm getting at here. So how many months in a year? There are 12 months in a year, right? So how many cranial nerves are there? There are 12 cranial nerves, or 12 pairs, I should say. And then what is the maximum number of days in a month? Well, 31. And guess how many pairs of spinal nerves we have? We have 31 pairs. So this is my little mnemonic for knowing how many cranial nerves. Well, you'll get very familiar with cranial nerves with this class, but spinal nerves, 31 total pairs. Now, a little review. So what we have here, and this is why I'm bringing up the different types or different regions of the vertebrae again. So the cervical spinal nerves are associated with the cervical vertebrae, but notice that breakfast at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 5 mnemonic doesn't quite work with this. So now breakfast is a little later when we're talking about the spinal nerves, but luckily thoracic and lumbar are the same. So why are there 8 cervical spinal nerves and only 7 cervical vertebrae, whereas the others are lining up evenly? So why are there 8 instead of 7 cervical spinal nerves? Well, think about it this way. So here we have our T1 vertebrae down here, and then we have our C7 vertebrae, and then let's stack all the vertebrae. I know not very anatomically correct, but I'm just showing you for simplicity's sake. And then what do we have so in between each of these vertebrae? So remember that like each vertebrae forms half of a foramen with the vertebrae that's immediately below it. So all these spinal nerves are exiting the spinal cord and are between these vertebrae. Now, what do we have on top of the C1? What do we have on top of the atlas? We also have we have again, the occipital bone and skull. You also have a spinal nerve that goes between the occipital bone condyles and I should say occipital condyles. You also have another spinal nerve that exits from the top and superior part of the C1 vertebrae. So let's count them. So we have C1 nerve. So we actually have 8 8 cervical spinal nerves, even though we only have 8 or 7 cervical vertebrae. So yeah, all of these are nerves. So again, 8 nerves, 8 cervical nerves, 8 or 7 cervical vertebrae. So this is why we have an extra, why in terms of the spinal nerves, breakfast is a little later. It starts at 8 because, again, we have an extra spinal nerve exiting between the skull and the top of the C1 vertebra. Now, this is something we didn't talk about for the Unit 2 exam, but innervation. And again, now we're talking about nerves. Now we can bring back innervation into the picture. Am I going to ask you the innervation of all the muscles previously? Not really. Whatever I cover, if I do mention innervation, or if your TA, if you're taking the lab, they do mention innervation, that's fair game. I'm not going to ask you the innervation for every single muscle, but I will have some particular areas of the body I want you to know for innervation. So what is innervation? Well, basically, do you have nerves in that part of the body? That's what it is in a nutshell. And what we have, remember that the spinal nerves, except for the C1, which is mostly motor, they're mixed nerves. So they both have sensory, they both have sensory input and they have motor output. So sensory nerves that innervate a tissue, they're basically the little receptors and detectors in that tissue. So they're going to send information of that tissue and changes in that tissue's internal and external environment to your central nervous system. And the motor nerves that innervate a tissue, such as a skeletal muscle, cause a response in response to commands from the central nervous system. So if we have a motor nerve that innervates a muscle, when you activate that motor nerve, like remember those motor units, when you activate that motor nerve that innervates some skeletal muscle, that's going to cause that skeletal muscle to contract. But is it just skeletal muscle? Well, you can also have visceral motor nerves that innervate organs. So these might tell the heart to beat faster or slower. Or they might innervate a blood vessel and tell it to shrink or constrict or dilate and expand. So you have sensory nerves that sense things and carry signals to the central nervous system. Motor nerves carry out the effects. They carry out the commands from the central nervous system. but innervation refers to that supply. Now to cover those dermatomes again, so what we have here are all these different parts of the body that, or actually surfaces of the body that are innervated by spinal nerves from that region. And notice that actually in the OpenStax version, they have some nerve regions like over here, here, and here that have multiple spinal nerves. And that's the other thing with dermatomes is that sometimes they overlap. They're not hard borders like borders between countries or most borders between countries. They're not like walls. Like sometimes you have overlap where sometimes the branches of a spinal nerve actually can innervate multiple the same area. So think of it not so much of like strict firm borders where the border of one is the start of another. Think of it if they drew a picture that was more accurate, it would look more like a watercolor painting with things kind of bleeding into each other. But for simplicity's sake, this is where it is. Now, why do I bring this up? Oh, look at that. So what do this person have here? They have all these red blotchy spots right here. And what they have is an infection, or actually a reemergence of an infection. And this is what we see when someone has shingles. Now, shingles typically happen where this is what we saw in that previous one. There are these very, very painful rashes and blisters. And it's caused by this varicella zoster virus, also known as our chickenpox virus. And so I think most people, or maybe your parents, and especially your grandparents, they might have had, like, I think the vaccine against varicella zoster virus is, I think most people these days, especially your age or younger, they're vaccinated against this, so they didn't get the chickenpox itself because you were vaccinated. But ask your mothers and fathers and grandparents or older relatives whether they got chickenpox as a child. Most likely, at least if you grew up in the US and locally, you probably did. They probably did get infected with chickenpox. But the great thing is, like, once you're infected, then that prevents you from getting these blisters again as a child. At least hopefully that's what happens. But thing is that the virus doesn't go away completely. You do have that immunity against it to an extent, but the virus likes to hang out in something we call viral latency. So latency sounds like late, right, or later, and that's kind of what the virus does. It reemerges later if you have the viral latency. So these viruses actually hide out in nerves. So nerves kind of like, well, you don't want your immune system attacking your nerves because again, this is going to cause nerve damage. So nerves have a little protection against your immune system. So viruses like the varicella zoster virus, they love hiding out in nerves because this is kind of like a relatively safe haven from your immune system. So with viral latency, these things you can get infected with chickenpox, and it can reemerge later in life. Uh, so average age, then this is why it's a latency. So and maybe some of your, well, if you have older parents or your grandparents, this is the average age is 50 plus. And there's always like somebody who says like, well, I got shingles or my friend got shingles and they were only 20 something. Again, that's the average age, and some people they do get this reemergence of shingles later on in life. Now, this is like shingles incidence per 1,000 people, and notice that like over here, the top lines, these are older people, and you see a more increased incidence of reemergence and shingles occurring in older populations compared to younger ones. Like if they had 20 people in their 20s, they'd probably be down here somewhere. So yeah, the later on in your life, the more risk of having shingles. And there's a 1 in 3 lifetime chance. So there's about 390-ish of us in the class. So there's a 1 in over our entire lifetime, like a third of us on average is going to get shingles. Now, so shingles, this varicella zoster virus, through viral latency, hangs out in neurons, and it loves to hang out in these spinal nerves. So what we have here is, oh, look at all those blisters over here. Oof. So I'm thinking this person probably had a reemergence of shingles and this virus in this C3 dermatome. So probably their C3 spinal nerve on their left side was affected, and then they had this reemergence of this virus causing these blisters over here. So I'm thinking C3. How about here? Well, looks like it's on their shoulder, a bit of their anterior chest, and the left shoulder. So I'm thinking this person probably had an infection of this virus in this C5. Notice that this kind of corresponds with the pattern of a dermatome. Again, these dermatomes are kind of like rough maps. They're not exactly there, but they kind of follow these maps. And ooh, look at this. I assume it's a guy, but what we have here is like, oh, a very, very wide band. And I'm not entirely sure. It might be multiple, probably one, but it might be T8 or T9 around this abdomen. But the thing is that we see this along these borders over here. So they kind of roughly correspond to these dermatomes when they reemerge. Because again, if they infect the spinal nerve and they reemerge from that spinal nerve, where does that spinal nerve innervate? Well, it's along these dermatomes over here. So what is this viral latency? So it's interesting. I'm going to draw a very cartoony chickenpox virus, and this varicella zoster. And what happens when it infects a cell is not only does it enter the cell, it also integrates its viral genome, its DNA, or nucleic acids, I should say, into the DNA of your nuclei. So it actually integrates its own nucleic acids and codes into the cells and into the nuclei of the neurons. So what happens is it hides out as DNA. It's not a full virus anymore. Now, through various triggers, and there's many triggers thought to trigger the reemergence of this virus, but what happens is, okay, this virus infects your neurons, and then it hides out as, integrates itself into your DNA, and then later on, remember that DNA makes mRNA, makes protein. So later on in life, this is what happens when we have this reemergence of shingles. This DNA gets read, transcribed, and then translated to produce a lot of these viruses, and these viruses reemerge from what was previously genetic information. And this is what causes all that blistering and those painful things we see with shingles. So this is why these shingles tend to go along dermatomes. If we have something like here, or so why do they tend to appear on only one side of the body? Well, if you have the virus only infecting one of the pair of spinal nerves, it's not affecting the other part that hasn't been affected. So if this virus affects only and infects only one of a pair of spinal nerves, if it reemerges later on in life after a period of viral latency, those blisters are only going to appear on the side that was infected. If it is bilateral, in other words, the fancy term for meaning on both sides, that means probably both of the left and right of a pair of spinal nerves were affected. But typically, only one of the pair is infected by this virus. So this is why shingles tend to appear on only one side. Now, shingles, so innervation, this is why I bring up innervation, because remember, innervation is not just about sending commands to muscles or organs. It's also about sensation and feeling things. That's why I brought up those those somatosensation tests in the previous lecture. So these symptoms what type of things are general senses we feel through somatosensation and through various parts of our body. We can feel numbness, we can feel tingling, we can feel pain, we can feel heat. So often when people have shingles, or when they have a episode of shingles, they feel multiple sensations, even though there's no real stimuli or extreme changes in temperature or something jabbing them or causing them to itch or have cause them real pain. This is affecting those nerves that would detect those changes, and they're causing these nerves to fire off all these signals of sensations that aren't really there. So this is why sometimes people who have shingles on a part of their body, they can't even, or like my friend who had shingles, she said like she couldn't even put on clothes on that part of the body because just having clothes touch that part of her body that was affected, it sent searing pain to her, and she always felt too hot and too cold at the same time on that part of their body. So these symptoms last for weeks because viral infections, they have to be cleared out by your immune system and take a while to tamper down. So antiviral drugs sometimes help to reduce the period of these symptoms, but they don't cure it completely. So if you're taking microbiology, you probably know that compared to antibiotics, it's a lot easier to cure a bacterial infection with antibiotics than it is to clear a viral infection with antiviral drugs. So it helps to shorten, but it's really hard to cure it overnight. And vaccinations, I think they help to prevent or reduce the chance of shingles. That's why in older people who are over 50 or older patients, they often asked to prescribe it, or they say like, hey, maybe you should get a shingles vaccine so you reduce the chance to get shingles. The good news about shingles is that you will very, very, very unlikely to die from it. But if it's to the point where you're feeling 24/7 pain in one part of your body and there's nothing you can do about it and you can't sleep because of that, well, that is debilitating. So it sucks to have shingles. You won't die, but it can really take you out for a long time. And let's end on nerve plexuses. So nerve plexuses, what's a plexus? So in general, a plexus is some highly branched network. So when you have a nerve plexus, it's a branched network of a nerve. So these spinal nerves, they're not just one linear sort of branching object. They actually interweave and intermix among each other in these structures we call plexuses. So there's the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, and then the lumbar and sacral plexuses. Sometimes they're considered one and the same, or not one and the same, but they're considered as a whole. So sometimes you might see the term lumbosacral plexus. And then there's a coccygeal plexus, which is very, very small and very simple. So we won't really cover that in detail. Now, this is the OpenStax version of the plexuses of the body. And again, this is where I think this is one of the parts where OpenStax, and I think OSU also uses the same image. I don't think this is a really one. It's good as an overview, but from studying from this picture, it's kind of very hard to see what's going on here. But you notice that these nerves that are emerging from these vertebrae and these roots over here, they're intertwining, so they're not just linear strands like cords. They're actually interweaving and forming these large networks. And we have this lumbar plexus and sacral plexus. Can you see a really clear definition between the two? There is a sort of, there is something that says whether it's a lumbar or sacral plexus, but this is why sometimes you consider it a lumbosacral plexus, because again, it knows that it all kind of interweaves and interlaces over here. So what's a plexus? Okay, so we have our plexuses, and these are the four I want you to know. But know that they're there, but do I want you to know the exact anatomy? So if we're knowing the exact anatomy of these plexuses, I think that's more of a, I don't know if it's even something that's tested at 300 level. That's more like if you're going to grad school with anatomy, or if you're going to medicine, yeah, then the plexuses come into place. So this is the cervical plexus. Again, notice that these branches of these nerves are not just simple lines and they don't branch at all. They're actually forming, especially in the cervical plexus, notice that you have these loops. Now, do I want you to know the anatomy of this? No, again, this is, not that it's not important, but I think it's a little much for this level. But this is what I want you to know. Notice that there's a lot of information like spinal segments. This is telling you which of the vertebrae and spinal segments, or not vertebrae, but which of these spinal nerves that they're emerging from. So sometimes you have multiple spinal nerves that they start off separate and they fuse to form another nerve. So this is what we have with these spinal segments. Sometimes you only have one, sometimes you have multiple, like we have here. Do I want you to know these spinal segments for this class? I think that's a little too much for this class right now. Unless it's like very specific ones, I'll point it out. But this is what I want you to focus on. Like things like these nerves right here, great auricular, auricle, what's that? The ear, or lesser occipital, transverse cervical, phrenic, supraclavicular. So supra means superior, clavicle meaning over here. So what I want you to know is that these nerves that are bolded over here are part of the cervical plexus. Some of these are very obvious, but this is one you should really pay attention to, the phrenic over here. Because why? Well, it innervates your diaphragm. That's like, wait, so you're telling me the spinal nerves that lead to the phrenic nerve, they actually come from the cervical plexus and they end up down here in the diaphragm that's nowhere near my neck? And yes, that's the interesting thing. Like you, the phrenic nerve is actually, the roots are actually all the way up in your neck. They're not down here toward your abdomen. They're actually all start all the way up here in your neck. So that's also a big difference. Like say someone has a neck injury, if they say they break and sever all the nerves below their C7, well, they can still breathe on their own. But if they like sever up here, then they're going to have trouble breathing because they damaged the roots of their phrenic nerve. So this is why it's very important to know your phrenic nerve has the roots up here. Now, brachial plexus. Oh, if you might taking like KRS or have already taken upper division, you'll get very familiar with this. And I do have a brachial plexus video up on my YouTube channel. It teaches you how to draw this, and my students who have entered in PT school, they said that they were quizzed on that, or they had to learn this within the first week or first month of it. So this seems very complex, but schematics like these will become your best friend when you're in PT school or if you're taking anatomy in med school. But what does a brachial plexus is? So brachial refers to arm, right? So that was just showing you a stylized and simplified version of what we're seeing over here. So we have all these roots over here. So it starts at 5, 6, 7, 8, T1. That's where the roots are. And then it branches all the way down your arm and innervates everything along your arm all the way down to your fingertips. So that's a brachial plexus. So, I mean, and the funny thing, it looks complex here, but this is actually, I think, the simplest plexus. The other ones are way more complex than the brachial plexus. But again, do I want you to know the brachial plexus? I mean, if I do test you on it, it'll be an extra credit sort of thing. But yeah, I think it's a little advanced, complex. I mean, plexuses are just inherently complex. Okay, so here we have the innervation of the arm. So it's not just about sensation, but also motor control as well. So we have the axillary, musculocutaneous, radial, median, and ulnar. So these are some of the major nerves that innervate the arm and the muscles that help to control the arm and shoulder. And what you have here is like, okay, the brachial plexus also has things like the suprascapular nerve, the subscapular nerve, and axillary. And notice that they innervate these muscles over here and control them. Hey, the ones I bolded, these are rotator cuff muscles, right? So this is why the brachial plexus is very important. It's not just about arm movement, but also like that rotator cuff as well. So let's see. So here we're showing more in the distal part where we're talking about like innervation at the hand over here. Now this is a little, I think this is from the Martini version. I don't think OpenStax actually has this. But what am I trying to show here? Well, there's a very important nerve in the brachial plexus called the median nerve. And notice that the median nerve innervates like these three, or actually 3.5 of your fingers, and the ulnar innervates your digiti minimi and your ring finger over here. So why are the or let's see, and I think this is where it's a little crunchy because I did have to reshuffle these lectures. All right. Why are they so complex? Well, the thing is that what happens if you start damaging these nerves, or say you have some sort of trauma, or you have like something that hits your shoulder, or something that kind of like causes a injury along your shoulder and starts to sever some of these nerves, or some of these cords and branches, or some of any sort of the structure in this nerve. Well, things that many of these nerves aren't just supplied with just one spinal nerve roots. They're actually supplied by multiple spinal segments. And why is that? Well, if you have one of these roots that are severed, if you only had one nerve or one root per nerve, what happens if you sever that root over here? Well, that's going to block all signals to and from that nerve to the central nervous system. So I like to think of it this way. This is another analogy I like to draw between the plexuses. They're kind of like the road maps of your central or of your nervous system. So say you're here on an island and you're commuting from Eva, that long commute. Like I did that in high school and undergrad. I'm like, how do you get to town from Eva side, that very long commute? Well, there's multiple ways you can get to UH. Is there just one road you can take to UH, and if it gets blocked up, you can't get to UH? Well, there's many ways. Like you might take this route over here and get to UH this way, or you can take this route. Maybe you want to go skirt around Punch Bowl and Pulawaina and go more along this route over here. Or you can go, maybe you want to go more closer to Ala Moana side and go this way to campus. Or you can take the H1. There are many ways to get to UH from the west side. So same with your nerves. This is why they often have multiple spinal segments, because you have multiple routes that supply one nerve. Now, what happens if this is the route you take to going to UH and then there's an accident? Something's blocking the road. Can you get to UH that way? Nope. So this is kind of like when you get nerve damage along one of these the structures in these plexuses. If you have nerve damage, that's going to interrupt the signals to and from these nerves. So you have to find another route. So you might take another route, but say that route gets damaged. Well, maybe take another route. And if that route gets blocked off, take yet another route. So this is why it's useful to have multiple routes and sources to one nerve. In case you have one of these like routes that are damaged, or something that's downstream and more distal getting damaged, you have another way of getting signals to and from a nerve, even if there are some damages to nerves and the plexuses along the way. So this is where I have to talk. I have to put. So let me read this out for you because it's kind of blocking it. So lesion is a general term, medical term referring to tissue damage or some sort of injury. And the thing is that your nerve branches are supported by multiple routes. And then lesions to one area. So this is why it's useful to have multiple spinal segments. And this, even though it makes the anatomy very tough, there's a reason why having a network is more useful than just a one route, only having one route to a nerve. If you get a lesion to a nerve or a root, it won't necessarily completely paralyze an area. You can just swim in the Isle of White Canal. That'd be beautiful. Yeah, you might pick up some infection. But the thing about these lesions, it's not just about whether they're there or not, but also where they're located. Say you have like like an accident further along the H1 that's closer to the west side, or along a major, what's typically a major like high traffic area of the H1. That's going to back up traffic and keep people from reaching campus more than if you had like an accident on a distant side road, right? So what if you had an accident all the way up here that's closer to the source? It's going to block off everything it's going to block off more signals from that source. So think that this is like, maybe some of you were kids at this time, but back in 2006, what happens is that there was a military truck, right? Yeah, and then basically this little crane part right here, it hit this part of the H1. They had to close the entire overpass because they were afraid it would fall down. And then this happened, and it was so bad, people were stuck there to midnight. Or a more recently, like in September. And I know I heard someone, this injured person is actually someone who, yeah, it was very like a tragedy that happened, but people were stuck there for hours. So like this is a major route that carries a lot of traffic. And I think this person, like, I think it started at like 8, and then this person, these people finally made it out of the mess close to midnight. So my main thing is I'm saying like, okay, if you have a major route and then you have damage to that route, that's going to really cause major effects, everything downstream of that route. So yeah, that's crazy. So what happens if you have damage to closer to the source? So if, say, an example of this is like Erb's palsy, what happens is that this is a nerve damage to the brachial plexus, but instead of damaging something that's more distal and further away from the roots, that would be closer here to the cervical plexus and that T1, this is actually damaging it, yeah, close to the source. And what happens is that this is often due to obstructive labor. And what happens is that you get a loss of motor control of that arm and also atrophy. So here's someone with Erb's palsy, and this is why we see what we call the waiter's tip sort of like sign. Notice this kind of like inward rotation of this baby's arm and also his arm as well. And the hand is kind of going this way too, right? So what we see is that during labor, if the baby gets stuck during delivery and then you kind of pull too hard and damage all the nerve roots here that innervate the brachial plexus, this causes permanent damage or could cause permanent damage to the nerves and all the sensate innervation along that same arm. Like, look at this guy. I mean, maybe he doesn't bench press much, but look at the muscularity of this arm compared to here. Like, his delts are way bigger over here, and especially his biceps and brachialis over here. Notice that he doesn't have as much muscle tone over here. So this is why the brachial plexus is very important because, again, if you have some sort of damage to this nerves, it's going to affect all the muscles that are innervated by the brachial plexus. Like here's another example of nerve damage. So remember that nerves are not just, spinal nerves are not just about sensation, but also about motor control as well, especially of skeletal muscle. Like this example over here, notice this deltoid, this is the normal one, but assuming he has, I think I did get this from Herb's palsy site talking about Herb's palsy, but notice that this deltoid, he barely has any mass over here as well, and even the bicep seems smaller compared to the one on his right. So whenever you have these nerve damage, this is why we see this muscular atrophy. It's not just about control, but also maintaining the tone of that muscle as well. Or here's another example. This guy probably had some sort of like injury to his left side. I mean, he looks like he works out for sure, but look at this delt over here compared to his left delt over here. Which arm do you think got injured? Maybe if he got injury to the roots or nerves that supply the deltoid, that's going to affect the tone and the overall mass of the deltoid because he's having a loss of motor output to that deltoid. So that's why innervation of the arm is very important. I think we're over time for sure. Yeah, we're definitely over time. So we're still talking about the arm, but I'm going to save this for Friday because I think we're going to talk about a very important topic pretty soon. But yeah, I know not to bring up like that really dark stuff, but it's just my main point with that example is like if you have a major route that has damage to it, that's going to cause a bigger effect versus if you have a small side street that's a distant branch getting damaged, that's not going to have as much effect as if you have damage to or a stop or blockage in a route that's more closer to the source. So again, distal damage, yeah, you have some nerve damage, but if it's closer to the roots and the spinal cord, that has a much larger effect compared to more distal lesion. All right, I know. Yeah, so yeah, stuck in traffic, but yeah, right. Oops, sorry, a little interruption, but yes. All right, so I'll see you all on Wednesday, or not Wednesday, but Friday. Thanks to our moderators for helping out, and see you. I'll try to keep things more lighter on Friday, all right? So take care. See you on Friday.